This week's episode is brought to you by an enchantment, originally printed all the way back in Alpha. For just 2 and 2 white, at the beginning of each player's upkeep, they take damage equal to the number of swamps they control. That's right. A big thank you to Karma for sponsoring this episode of Lucky Paper Radio. Seriously, thank you, Karma. Thank you so much. Thank you, Karma. Good evening, Anthony. How are you doing?
I'm doing okay. How are you doing tonight?
I'm great. I got myself a glass of Josh wine, so you know I'm doing good.
good Josh wine.
Yeah, Josh buys the good
is he
wine.
Spoiling you?
Yes, he is spoiling us. I mean, it's just his natural way. He's just a natural spoiler, and so I'm very blessed. Very blessed to have a nice glass of Josh wine with me. And hello to you listeners. Welcome to Lucky Paper Radio. This is your favorite podcast about Magic and Cube. I'm your host, Andy, and I'm here with Anthony. I forgot the nickname again. There's so many things to think about before an episode of the show. I forgot the nickname again. I'm sorry. You're not just some guy. You're a special man. We've been over this.
Oh, thanks.
Yeah, you're very special. We have an exciting topic, I think, for this episode. I'm really excited about this one. We're going to be talking about how to process playtesting experience and feedback from your playgroup into your cube design philosophy, into like informed cube design changes, which I think is a topic, Anthony, that hopefully will apply to everybody out there, regardless of the type of cube they have or the power level they play at. Just a kind of nice broad topic. So we're going to get into that later on in the episode. But first, of course, we're doing our Pack 1 Pick 1. This week we are doing a Pack 1 Pick 1 from Tuesday Tastic's Cube. You all may know Tuesday Tastic out there, aka Jacob. It's a person that runs a cube blog called Tuesday Tastic. You can find them on various social media platforms and cube communities under that name. And the cube that we are doing is their two-headed giant cube. So this is a cube that is drafted like the Battle Bond sets were. And Anthony, I actually never did a Battle Bond draft. I know you did a couple. What was your experience with those Battle Bond drafts?
So I think it was definitely an interesting format. Honestly, I don't think it had a lot of depth because of some specific details about the way that the draft works. But I don't want to speak too much ill of it before we actually see some cards.
Yeah, well, let's tell people how the draft actually does work. So tell me if I get any part of this wrong. So we are going to look at a pack as a team, one pack together. And from that pack, we get to take 2 cards and put them into a collective pool. And then once the draft is over, we're going to take that one big pool and build 2 decks for our, 2 heads of our two-headed giant. That's correct, right?
Right, yeah.
And in this case, Jacob has 16 card packs instead of 15 card packs, which is a slight deviation. And there's a couple other small rules changes here. I will link to a blog post where Jacob kind of describes all the rules changes. Basically, soul bond cards can work with your teammates' creatures, which is good. And that's pretty much really the only thing. There's a couple of details about how the cube works. But other than that, we're basically drafting as like Battle Bond. And this is exciting for me. I think it's interesting that the cards in Battle Bond were obviously to some degree designed for this, restriction and this means of drafting, but you can, of course, choose from Magic's history and find lots of cards that just also perform very well under these sort of stipulations and, basically do unexpected things given the sort of nature of two-headed giant draft. So I think it's an exciting context to reevaluate cards in.
Two-headed giant is always kind of a lot of fun because obviously it's great just to be able to play Magic with somebody else, whereas it's so much just like a solo game. But it also just forces you to recontextualize a lot of cards, which is what we love about Magic. So I remember in the last two-headed giant I played, we had I think 2 copies of Gary, Grey Merchant of Asphodel, which does double the damage, and that was a ton of fun.
Yeah, anything that says each opponent is going to get a little bit buck wild in two-headed giant, generally speaking, because you're talking about 1 life total there, but you do have 2 opponents to take that life total from. Yeah, it's got to say, it's probably, I'm going to go ahead, right now, I think two-headed giant is probably my favorite way to, play casually. Obviously, I like as much as possible to, challenge myself and, try and do well and, spike the draft, as it were. But if I am going to play casually where there's no stakes or whatever, I would rather play two-headed giant than, do an EDH pod or whatever. I think it's a lot of fun to play with somebody else and, get to try and do something weird with a teammate. So It's a good format. It's one of my favorite casual parts of pre-release is when I get to do two-headed giant, especially with my friend Anthony.
I had no idea. We should do more two-headed giant.
We should. Problem is, Anthony, we can't. We got there again. We went to the dark place. All right. I'm going to read all the cards in this pack for those of you that are following along at home and want to sort of play along and guess what we're going to take or decide what you're going to take and then listen to our evaluations. While I'm doing that, Anthony, I want you to pick your, top contenders. What are your, top 4 or 6 cards that you think we should be looking at? So, in order, we have, in this pack, Brushland, Dakra Mystic, Tragic Slip, Blaring Captain, Garrick Wildspeaker, Windfall, Caustic Caterpillar, Cogwork Librarian, Tyrant of Valakut, Arcane Denial, Fall of the Titans, Grothama All-Devouring, Discovery Dispersal, Jiraga Auxiliary, Blade of the Blood Chief, and Silver Smote Ghoul. So that is our pack, Anthony. What are you looking at? This is actually a great format for us to do in the podcast because we're basically, sitting at a draft table together. We're on a team. Let's pretend. What are your contenders out of this pack?
I think, honestly, the 3 cards that really stand out to me are Garrick Wildspeaker, Tyrant of Valakut, and Fall of the Titans. Was Surge actually worded this way originally, that you get to pay the Surge cost if your teammate has cast a card, or have these been reworded for this cube?
I believe that's how it was originally worded. I think we're looking at the actual printings from Oath of the Gatewatch with the Surge mechanic here.
That just seems extremely strong. Like, Surge, you have to be able to cast it as your second spell for the turn, which is pretty difficult in a normal game of Magic. But when your teammate has to cast a spell, being able to trigger Surge seems very, very easy, and you're not losing mana to be able to set it up. So I think both of those Surge cards really stand out to me, and Garrick as well, just for being the only Planeswalker and a very powerful card. What are you looking at?
So I'm looking at a similar set of cards. I have 5 here that I think are actually, I have 5 I think that are pretty significantly better than everything else, and they are the 3 you included. Plus, I'm going to throw Cogwork Librarian into the mix, and I'm also going to throw Discovery Dispersal into the mix as cards that I think are all sort of within contention. So the reasons you mentioned for the Surge cost, right? So, Fall of the Titans, for those who don't know the card, it's XX red for a card that deals X damage to each of up to 2 target creatures and or players. But the Surge cost is just XR. So, basically it's just 2 fireballs, or, 2 blazes that you get to point different directions, which is extraordinarily powerful. For 4 mana, you're going to deal 3 damage to 2 targets. It's going to be a 4 mana, 2-for-1 very, very often. So it's just really, really strong. Similarly, the Tower of Valakut is normally a 7 mana 5/4 with flying, but if you pay the Surge cost, it's a 5 mana 5/4 with flying, 3 red, red. And when it enters the battlefield, it deals 3 damage to target creature or player. So just a really super messed up Flame Tongue Kavu, but with wings and really sweet art. I remember seeing the art for this card when this set came out and thinking I wish the card was better because the art is incredible. But it's really, really good here.
The evasion is extremely relevant in Two-Headed Giant, where board states can get pretty clogged up pretty quickly. And then being able to bolt a relevant target is, again, very powerful.
Yeah, so and I'll actually say I think those are a little bit ahead of Garrick for me. I do like that Garrick can untap my teammates' lands. It doesn't have to target lands cool. I control. It can untap my teammates' lands, so that does get a little bit different in this environment. But that's a thing. And then Discovery Dispersal I'm looking at. So this is a card I just like normally for the Discovery side. Any blue or black deck is happy to play a Surveil 2, then draw a card, I think. But Dispersal here, like the Surge cost, gets a lot better. It becomes 5 mana, return the 2 highest CMC permanents, each of your sort of opponents control to their hand, and they both discard a card, which I think seems very, very good. Dispersal on its own is already like a fine enough upside on Discovery that you're happy to play it. And again, when it's a 5 mana 4-for-1 kind of, you're taking 2 things off the board and making them discard 2 cards. I think the ceiling is going to be there. But I got to say, for me, the sort of highest value card with a bullet in this pack, I think, is Cogwork Librarian.
Wow.
I know you've played this card before. So this is one of the conspiracy cards that you have to draft face up. It's a 4 mana 3/3, but no one cares about that. As you draft a card, you may draft an additional card from that pack if you do put Cogwork Librarian back into the booster pack. So basically, you just buy yourself a pick in the future from another pack. And I avoid the Draft Matters cards in my own cube for a variety of reasons. One of them is that their value level dramatically falls off later in the packs. Like you open up a pack 3 Cogwork Librarian and you're not in as good a spot. But I'm very happy to take this pack 1, pick 1 for a couple of reasons. One, it's very, very open. Obviously, we're not committing to anything. We're in fact not going to play this card we're picking. So we're just saying, I would like another pack 1, pick 1 later on when I have more information about what it is I'm playing, which I think is a really high value. Yeah, and the other reason is just that so oftentimes the packs break in weird ways where you just have a pack that has a lot of good cards for your deck, or decks in this case, and being able to kind of cash this in to get that value, I think is well worth it. So for me, it's if we're on a team here, I'm going to say going to exercise my teammate vote and say one of our cards is Clockwork Librarian, and what is your choice for the second card? Or maybe you want to fight me on Clockwork Librarian.
Yeah, I'm going to fight you on that. I mean, doesn't
do it?
So I love Clockwork Librarian as well, and it definitely goes way up in value in a cube that especially has a huge power level delta, like some extreme outliers, because it basically gives you an extra pick one, which is extremely powerful. But when we're taking it pack one, aren't we just like giving up another pack one pick? Like,
so here though we don't know what we're doing with these decks yet, right? So like
that's true.
This
but
which is
again,
why I say like pack
two
or something. Yeah, go ahead, fight me.
I want to fight you on that because this draft works a little bit differently than a normal draft. So you're saying we don't really know what direction we're going on, but because we're building two decks and, when we're picking cards, we're not choosing which deck they go into, we will likely end up playing 4, maybe all 5 colors. And so we can pretty much just take whatever the most powerful card is and be confident it'll end up in one of those decks, unless there's like extreme synergies where there's more than just, the 5 colors to worry about, like what your deck is trying to do.
Or so, perhaps arriving at one of the things you maybe felt like was not replayable about Battle Bond.
Absolutely, yeah, because you don't really need to draft around like what matters and like find the open colors. You kind of can just take the best cards out of every pack and just put them into one of the 2 decks and it'll work out. And I think that Clockwork Librarian especially goes down in value for me because of that, because we can just take the good cards and it's going to be fine. The other thing is, because we are getting 2 packs out of every pick, it's not an extra a second pick from a pack. It's a third pick, which I think is a considerable downside in value.
Those are 2 good points. Those are 2 good points, and I'm willing to let you talk me out of it. So it's worth noting that like we called out, with the exception of Librarian and Wild Speaker, the other 3 cards we called out here are cards that perform dramatically differently in this environment than they would in a normal cube, right? Or a normal Magic set. And I think those cards are always worth a second look in a novel cube like this, because in most cases, they were not designed with this use case in mind, and they could be extraordinarily overpowered. I don't know that like Fall of the Titans or Tyrant of Valakut or Dispersal is going to be broken here, but I suspect they will be better than almost anything else we can do within the like normal range of what Magic sort of allows you to do. And Librarian, being a conspiracy card, also exists in that sort of realm where it's outside of the typical things you can do at a Magic draft. So I think those things are all worth a second look. But you make a couple good points. So you're right, I think, on both those points. One being that we don't really have to pass any good cards because we are almost guaranteed to be 4 and could very easily be, a splashed 5th color and just take every powerful card we see in the pack for the rest of the draft, even if we didn't have a Clockwork Librarian. And then the second point, of course, being that the second card out of a pack is a much higher value than the third card out of a pack when you can already take 2. So, all right, I think you've talked me out of it.
Nice.
So If you're going to veto Librarian, I'm going to veto Wild Speaker. I think we can do better than that. And also, if we're sitting down to this 2-headed giant draft, I want to experience the full novelty of cards that are recontextualized and not just sort of good cards in general.
I'm moving up on Garrick the more I think about it, because the value of being able to cast it on turn 4 and then ramp yourself to 6 or 7 the next turn is great in a normal format. But to your point, being able to cast this on turn 4 and immediately put your ally up to 6 mana, that's extremely powerful.
Oh boy, you're just going to talk me out of all of my things here. Okay, all right, fine.
It's
so
tough.
Is that your highest card in the pack then? Is Wild Speaker?
I think so. When in doubt, pick a green card, right?
Because I will say the one thing I will say to maybe put a little hole in Garrick Wild Speaker's armor is that I do expect Planeswalkers in a 2-headed giant format to be a little more susceptible to just being attacked, because there'll be 2 decks to threaten it, which is, I think, often harder to protect than just 1.
That's fair.
I'm curious now to see how Garrick plays out, because being able to untap your opponent's lands and, let's say you play a turn 1 Dork and then a turn 3 Garrick, and then you put your opponent on a quadrillion mana on turn 3, can they do something totally broken? So let's do that. And then if we're going to do that, I think I'm going to be in agreement with you and say we should either take Fall of the Titans or Tyrant of Valakut. I think Tyrant of Valakut has the higher ceiling here, but Fall of the Titans is just 2 removal spells, which is pretty good.
They're both pretty good. It's a tough choice. I don't know. Maybe we just take both Fall and Tyrant and just draft 2 red decks.
We will have completely cut red from this pack, for what it's worth, if we do that.
So you also mentioned Discovery Dispersal, which I actually didn't read. It's hard to read so many cards,
especially
but the fact that
it, horizontal ones.
Yeah, it does not target, but it affects both of your opponents. Is pretty powerful. But how do you feel? Like, how do gold cards change in this context for you? ignoring the fact that Discovery is kind of just a hybrid card.
Yeah. For the reason you mentioned, I think I would be more likely to take a gold card here than I am in a one-headed draft, as it were, because, like you said, we get to build the best deck out of our entire pool, and so if we are picking good gold cards and get to the end of the draft and figure out like, oh, you know what, we got a lot of these good blue, black, gold cards, then it's pretty easy for us to get enough blue and black playables to put together a blue black deck. We can kind of like punt on that decision. And of course, this one is stapled to a hybrid card, which means that we're going to play it no matter what, even though I wouldn't first pick a Discovery out of a pack like this. It's like a decent floor to have. So yeah, I think I'm a little higher on gold cards here. I think the restriction is less than I would sort of rate it in a normal cube, a one-headed draft.
I just can't disagree more. I think that gold cards actually take an extra tax here because of the fact that we can stay so open just by taking monocolored cards. If we actually take gold cards that end up being in, multiple overlapping guilds, those are actually the things that do restrict us into figuring out how we're going to build our deck. And I don't think it's powerful enough to make me want to say committing to one of our decks is going to be blue-black.
Why is that more of a cost than in one player, though? Like, I understand what you're saying. Like, if you take nothing but monocolored cards, then you can put them together in any combination, right? Mm-hmm. And if you have gold cards, now all of a sudden these two colors have to be in this same deck for this card to be castable. But how is that more of a restriction than in a one-headed draft, as it were, where, you're going to be one of 10 color pairs and you're committing to 1/10 of those color pairs immediately? Like, to me, it seems like we're going to be 2 of 10 color pairs, so this is like half as limiting to commit to a gold card, in a two-headed giant draft.
That's true. I think it's still more castable, like more likely to be able to make the main deck than in a normal draft, but I think the monocolored cards are more boosted in terms of how easy it is to put them into your main deck than the gold cards. So I think comparatively, they still are worse to me.
Just on power level, I will say that I think these 2 red cards just happen to be better than Dispersal, but if Dispersal was a little better, I would be, like I said, I'm not too afraid of the gold card here as compared to a normal one-headed draft. But I think we're kind of in a similar place on that, even though maybe we disagree on exactly how it compares to a one-headed giant draft. So are we just on double red cards? Are we on Garrick and a red card? What is it going to be?
Double red cards honestly sounds pretty good, and they don't have to end up in the 2 different decks even. Like, if this just means like we're starting off making one of our decks very strong, that's
of course. a pretty
safe way to go. One other card we didn't talk about is Windfall. This is obviously a very powerful card, but do you think it actually has a place here?
I don't know yet. This is a big cube. This is 540 cards, and I did not look through the entire thing initially, but without some like significant way to really benefit from the broken symmetry, I'm not in for Windfall. Like, I would need to be doing some pretty broken stuff for this to be good. Like, we're both playing combo decks and we're digging for our combo pieces, or we're playing some sort of mill strategy and we want to sort of mill our opponent out, and this is a key way to do that. But it just, like, as a fair Magic card, I think it's quite bad.
Makes sense to me.
The other card that I want to mention, just because we said it but then never mentioned anything about it, I think taking Brushland here could also be entirely defensible. There's always a set of cards, I think, in every cube that just end up higher than fixing. And here I think these like 2 red Surge cards are. Garrick probably is. I still think Librarian is, but whatever. Everything else beyond that, I think, is you could argue that you should just take fixing, because it's very good to have fixing, and you're going to have 2 decks that need fixing, so it's not a terrible thing to do. I'm making us come to some sort of consensus here, Anthony, instead of just having our own picks, because we're simulating a 2-headed giant draft. I think we should go Garrick and... No, I want to go 2 red cards. I want to go Fall and Tyrant, because we cut it out from this pack. We just start with 2 good red cards, which we know will get played together in some deck no matter what. And I'm really excited about the comparative power increase of Surge in this environment.
I'm with you. That sounds like a great plan. We can let our table friends to the left take Garrick Wildspeaker and Gromotha and try and understand what that card does.
Grathama, I don't get it. I mean, it's just... it's a weird card.
I've read that card so many times, and I still don't know what it does.
I just can't figure out how you would do a good with it. I don't know. It's just... It's not my kind of card, certainly.
Sweet illustration, though. But
a 5-mana, 5/4 flying Flame Tongue Kavu that can also hit your opponent's face is definitely my kind of card, so I'm pretty excited about having that in our deck. Thank you, Jacob, a.k.a. Tuesday-tastic, a.k.a. Only on Tuesdays, for sending in your 2-headed giant cube. I think this is a very cool environment, and I'd love to get a chance to do something like this with a friend in paper sometime. If you want to have your cube on Lucky Paper Radio, you should send us an email at mail@luckypaper.co, send us a link to your cube, send us a description of what it's all about, send us your pronouns and how you want to be credited, and we will do your cube on the show. especially if it's an interesting novel cube, because it's always fun to recontextualize cards and have Anthony prove that I'm wrong about Cogwork Librarian and the gold card dispersal.
It's hardly proof. It's barely a hypothesis.
I got dunked on, friends. Shamed on my own show. There's nothing left for me here. I have a little cube project I've been working on that you know about, Anthony, that I'm not ready to talk with the whole world about. It's, we'll get to it at some point when I feel like I've...
Great, that sounds like an awesome subject for a podcast.
Well, we're going to get there eventually. And this is a blatant teaser. I'm going to I'm going to tease all of you listening. We're not going to talk about that cube tonight on the show because it's not quite... I haven't quite digested it and processed it enough to present it to the outside world yet. If you want to know more about it, you can join the MTG Cube Discord. I'll link it in the show description. We're talking about it there pretty often. So if you're curious, you can go find out. But what I really want to talk about, Anthony, because this cube has been sort of front of mind for me for a little while, is how you as a cube designer should process playtesting, quote unquote data, experience playtesting a cube, and feedback from your players and playgroup, and turn that into some magical alchemy that makes your cube better and do something with that information. Let's just start, I think, with the most basic level of this, which I think is actual playtesting, right? There's a lot of ways you could treat your playtesting experience to inform your cube design experience, right? I've seen a lot of people that will play the cube a few times and be like, well, this deck keeps winning, so this is a deck we have to cut. Or, I played this cube a few times, I can never make this card work, so this card must be bad, we have to cut it. Oftentimes, whatever the sort of winningest decks or least winningest decks are, get kind of cut down or built up respectively based on the actual playtesting data. But something that we talk about a lot, or we've at least talked about on our website and articles, is that if you're just a person with a play group and you're playing your Magic Cube, you are not really going to generate enough draft data to make statistically significant decisions based on the outcomes of those drafts. Unless you're drafting with your play group a few hundred times a week, you're not going to have enough drafts to determine, is there actually a truly favored deck in this cube? Because there's all this noise in the data, right? There's just variance of how the packs broke, of how mana screwed or not mana screwed players got during the draft. There is player skill level variance. If the good player keeps winning, then whatever they're drafting seems the best because they're just the better player. There's all of these variables you have to kind of try and weed out if you're doing this statistically, and you just can't do that. Actually, Jet, who was the guest on the show last week, he has a great article on Lucky Paper, which I'll put in the description, which I think does a very good job making the case for why you just can't evaluate those things with big data and trying to figure out those things, statistically. So, Anthony, I'm curious just to know your perspective. I think you probably agree with me that just looking at, the data of what deck won and trying to figure out if that deck is too good is not really a great way to go about it. So how do you, if we play your cube and, if something does well or does poorly, what do you actually do with the sort of results of games and playtests of your cube?
I mean, more important than just what's winning or not winning, obviously there is an important piece of data there, which is that you just don't want the cube to have an obvious this is the only way to win, so either you force that or you just have no opportunity to actually win the draft. So that's relevant, but actually, like you said, difficult to get quantitative data. More important, I think, is just coming up with hypotheses and good explanations for why a particular format or a particular archetype or deck is either overpowered or underpowered, and coming up with a way to actually figure out what the cube needs to create more positive play patterns. But maybe the more important thing is just talking to your players and figure out what is fun and what is not fun, because there may be strategies that even are not that good, so are not problematic for that reason, but just introduce horrible play patterns. It's important to listen to your players.
Yeah, the way that I have been explaining how I treat playtest experience is that I care about the experience, not the results, right? I don't care which deck won or which deck lost. What I care about is, did any of my players feel like their deck was terrible and had no chance? If so, why? Did any of my players feel like their deck was completely unbeatable? And if so, why? Did any of my players feel like they couldn't beat a particular strategy or card? And what was the reasoning behind that? And basically kind of talking through all of those experiences, because the result is this very small piece of data. It's just, this deck went 3-0 or, went 2-1 or whatever. And that is very minimizing. And the actual experience of playing a game of Magic, much less a whole draft and, 3 matches, there is just endless data that you are presented with, right? And you're just bombarded with all of these different board states and decision points and all these different sort of diverging lines of possible play. And it's not worthwhile or really possible to like document all of those things and, go through and say like, well, here, if you had done something a little differently and gone this way, this card would have been good. But that sort of experience of just like seeping in, like living in that ocean of data by actual playtesting means that you have gained some, I think, very valuable perspective on a format that you have played even once. And the more times you play it, the more experience you get. And I think it's important to like learn to trust that experience instead of just trusting the data, which if you lose a match because you got mana screwed twice, you're not going to say like, well, my deck can't beat theirs, because that was not your experience, even though that was what the data will show. The data will show that you lost. So that's what I always say to people that are asking like, what do you do? I always say just like, think about the experience, not the results. And that's kind of the important thing, I think, for me with actual playtesting.
Right. So is it fair to say, like, we might sort of, as a shortcut, say the goal is to support, maybe 10 different archetypes and have them all be reasonably balanced. But that's not actually the goal. The goal is to have players feel like they can make decisions that matter by, like, finding the open archetype. And that's just not an experience that you can have if a particular archetype is way overpowered.
I think, people thinking about their cubes in terms of color pairs, having 10 archetypes that are, like, quote-unquote imbalance sounds nice in theory, but, like, the reality and the way things are drafted is that it's very unlikely that people are just going to fall neatly into, one of those lanes you've pre-decided for them. One of your players is going to, branch into 3 colors and play some splashes. One of your players is going to play a monocolored deck. A couple of players will split a guild completely, even if they're sitting close to each other, just because of the way the packs happen to break down. There were just really good cards in the same colors in the first pack, and they thought it was open, and it wasn't. So, like, the messiness of an actual draft, all of those, again, diverging, branching, like, possible decision trees means that, like, it's not going to break down as cleanly as you're, like, theory crafting these perfect archetypes. And so that's why I think it's really important to actually, like, get experience playing your environment and play testing with other people and hearing their perspective on it, because obviously you as the designer are, I think, very biased towards what you think works and doesn't work, and it can be hard oftentimes to hear other people that maybe don't share that bias and observe something different than what you're used to. It's so much more important to see how it actually plays than, how you expect it to play based on how you imagine the format to work.
Did your cube play like you expected the first time you played it?
It's been a long time, and I don't think I could really remember. I don't remember being too surprised. And I'll say that the first time I ever playtested my cube, it was with our, like, local play group in paper, and the experience I remember having is that, all of the skilled players won. And it was just that the best players in our play group won, and they played decks that kind of resembled what I expected a cube deck to look like, because, again, my cube I was inspired to build my cube from watching pro players stream the MTGO Vintage Cube, but I didn't have all the cards for the MTGO Vintage Cube, so I kind of cut some corners and put in a bunch of other stuff. So it was like, my initial inspiration was a Vintage Cube, but I didn't have any of the sort of powerful cards for that Vintage Cube, and so I kind of just used a bunch of binder chaff and, like, stuffed a cube together to resemble that. Yeah, I don't remember being totally shocked by the results, because, again, the skilled players won, and their decks were kind of what I expected, or at least in the realm of what I expected was possible. Do you remember the first draft of any of your cubes?
Vividly.
You do?
And it didn't work. Yeah, I mean, I had sort of expectations of the kinds of decks I thought people would want to draft, and it just really didn't turn out like I expected. I mean, the biggest issue was just that everything was way too slow, and everybody was, going to time in game one. So yeah, I mean, I really just put that on myself and said, like, the goal isn't to tell people, no, you're drafting this cube wrong, like, these are the archetypes that you're not seeing, try and do it this way. It was really, the burden is on me to make those archetypes more appealing and more visible, and also then just, like, tweak things so that the speed was more appropriate.
It's worth noting, too, that we've talked about how your cube is, I think, as more of a sort of creative foundation. It is an environment unto itself that you decided you wanted to make. Mine, like I said, was just like, there's not a cube in our play group, and what I know cube to be is the MTGO Vintage Cube, so I will try and approximate that. And I think my suspicion would be that was the kind of expectation with which I designed that first version of the cube, and I think that was also the expectation with which the players approached it. And so it's probably not surprising that the results mirrored my expectations, because I think people were drafting it as if it was the MTGO Vintage Cube, and that's the sort of context under which I built it. So the fact that their decks resembled, Vintage Cube decks just with different cards in them is probably to be expected. Your environment was not contextualized that way. It was like, here is a new environment Anthony's built to kind of reflect his values in the game. And so people kind of, I think, approached it maybe a little more like clean slate, like, all right, what's good here? Let me figure it out. And the result was people trying things you maybe didn't expect.
Definitely. Yeah, and also, it really made me reflect on a lot of cards that can look like signals. Like, I remember one player in particular seeing Oh, what is the card? I was just looking at it today.
Give me the mechanics.
It's an enchantment. At the beginning of your upkeep, your opponent mills 3 cards, and you draw a card for each land mill.
Patient rebuilding.
Patient rebuilding. So they saw that card and they said, "Oh, mill is an archetype in this cube. Like, I'll pick that and draft mill." And that is the only card that does any milling. It just turns out it's like a win condition in itself. So yeah, it's interesting how you can put something that you don't think of as a signal at all, and then your players will jump in and go sort of whole hog on it.
Your point about taking that playtesting experience and not blaming your players for doing anything wrong, I think is a very important point, because it highlights, I think, what I consider to be an important mentality for a cube designer, which is one of kind of humility and just accepting that it is your environment. You're the one that put the cards in those packs and put them before players, and ultimately what happened is a confluence of their values and their biases and the environment you put them in. But, if you've got 8 players and a lot of them are going to time, then you could try and blame them, but that's not going to help. If you can blame them all you want, but the next time you go to draft that environment, they're just going to be, first of all, if your friends still are friends with you after being blamed a bunch.
They're not going to come back if you blame them for drafting the cube wrong.
If you can't get them to come back, then, they're just going to do the same thing again, because they didn't consciously do it, right? That's just what seemed right to them based on the cards presented to them, right? Like, I think there's this idea that people are like consciously trying to like do things wrong or right when they're playing a draft, but the reality is that we all just look at a pack and cards look appealing to us based on how we evaluate cards, what we think is powerful, what we think is questionable. And so it's kind of like a natural thing, right? Like if you just play things out, which this comes up all the time. Like some cubes, if I play them, I will always end up drafting the same thing, even though I consciously know going into the packs, I'm like, I always end up playing blue-red tempo in this cube, and I just got to make sure I don't force blue-red tempo. I got to stay open and take whatever's good. But what's good to me just seems like blue-red tempo spells because of the way this particular cube is built. It's almost like I'm powerless to not. Like I have to like actively take what I think is a suboptimal pick to not, end up in that same archetype. So I think that's important. The other reason I think it's really important not to blame your players, there's nothing you can learn from that, basically, is what I'm getting at. Like if your result is to just blame your players, then like you have basically turned this experience, which is full of useful information to contextualize your further cube design goals, and you're just thrown out the window by saying, well, all these players did bad, and so like they didn't do what I wanted them to do, therefore all of that sort of information is useless to me, which is not a sort of path to making your cube better. And ultimately, like I think my goal is, with every chance I get to play cube or talk about cube with my friends, I'm trying to maximize that time in terms of like turning it into making my cube better. And you do that by basically being able to like process things and make changes and like learning and like gathering information. And if you're throwing information out, it's just not going to help you.
Nope.
Glug of wine. I want to talk a little bit more about this idea of you putting something into a cube and your players not taking it. Because while I stand firmly behind what I just said, which is that you should not blame your players, it is also, I think, very possible and quite common that players will obviously not draft optimally, right? And not drafting optimally is just, none of us are optimal drafters. Even the best players in the world are going to make mistakes in a given draft and sort of making decisions about packs. But oftentimes there's underlying biases that are hard to break. So we just looked at that pack, Anthony, and we talked about the sort of two-headed giant construct and the fact that Surge was a lot better here, and anything that said each opponent was a lot better here. And that's like a small example where this cube has a very big, bold deviation from a normal Magic thing. It's like, here's a whole new kind of draft. We're drafting it like Battle Bonds, two-headed giant. But every cube has much smaller, less, they're not in bright lights on the sort of, front facade, but smaller changes about the environment that make it different from any other environment you've ever played. And it's often impossible to know what those small changes are, especially if you're new to an environment. So it's entirely possible you would just miss cards. And this particular cube I referenced earlier that we won't talk about today is a very different environment from normal Magic, and cards are recontextualized in very different ways. And the first couple of times we drafted it with people, I talked through my sort of goals for the cube and how I thought it was going to play out. And still these cards, there's cards in there that look out of place because they just don't, they're cards people have never even seen before, and they're alongside other cards which are notoriously powerful, like some of the best cards ever printed. And it's like, why would I ever take this card I've never even seen? I don't know what it does. Like, there's just bias towards what people are familiar with, even though the environment is totally novel. So I'm curious to know, Anthony, how do you, like, what's your approach when you know that you have put cards in there that you think are really good, and people just are overlooking them. They're not taking them, they're not main decking them, even if they're in those colors, because they feel like they're no good. Do you just give up and throw them out, or do you draft it and try and beat them with it? Like, what is your strategy when you feel like you have made decisions that are good for the environment and people are just ignoring them?
It's been a mix of those things. I definitely end up drafting Boros a lot in my own cube because people are not particularly excited about it. Aside from a few of our players, I usually beat most people with it. It's a strong deck, which goes hand in hand with the fact that one of the great things about playing at sort of this middle power level is that you can really fine-tune things both up and down. So I've like made a conscious decision to really kind of overpower a lot of the Boros cards. So I think that's one option. Another thing that's sort of intrinsic in the way I've been designing my cube is there are a lot of small build-arounds. So my goal is that there's a ton of just like very flexible cards that can fit in lots of different places. And then, small archetypes that are maybe built around, as few as 3 cards that you might draft and then say, okay, well, now I have this sort of sub-theme in my deck that I want to draft around. And I think that fits very nice, or like that works really well in the sense that people can miss those and not really miss out on the whole draft experience. Like, you can just say, like, I'm drafting blue-red and I'll have a fine deck. But if you do want to dig deeper, and I really want to reward, like, allowing players to dig in and see a deeper play experience, then you can find these couple little build-arounds. So in a lot of cases, I have not found it to be a problem if things are being missed. But it does have the drawback again of, like, sometimes people way overvalue those and see, like, okay, well, this color pair is all about this particular mechanic, when it might not really be. That might be a pretty small theme.
Yeah, and it even comes down to, like, the individual card level, right? Like, I don't have a word for this bias, but I think we should maybe, like, try and coin one, perhaps. You're going to win games with whatever cards you put in your deck. Eventually, in the long arc of history, even if you draft a bad deck,
most players will win a game eventually.
Right. I think very few drafts end with somebody going 0-6. And so whatever you put in your deck, you're going to win with. And obviously, you are not going to win any games with anything you sideboarded or, didn't draft, even though it was in your colors, because it's just you have this bias for things that you are familiar with or whatever. So every player has bias, right? I have bias, you have bias. Any player who sits down at a table, like, bias just means, like, your tendency to, like, favor one thing over another for whatever reason. Some of our biases are correct, right? Like, we're biased towards certain types of spells that actually are 95% of the time better than other types of spells, and that's what all these sort of things together make for experience and make for sort of a skilled player. But a lot of those biases are not. It's just like, I've never heard this card before, and so, like, whatever. I'm just not gonna. I can't imagine It's good, or it's so difficult for me to, like, evaluate it, even though I think it might be good. I would rather lean on a card that I'm familiar with that is, perhaps has a much lower ceiling, but I know the floor on this card is good enough because I played it before, where the floor on this other card could be a total mystery to me. So it goes all the way down to, like, individual cards that the ones you're playing, you're going to think are good to a certain degree, or you're going to lose them in your hand, you're going to think they're bad, and the ones you're not playing, you're not going to get any more experience about. And that's the nature of draft, is that a lot of cards just don't get played. So I think that you as a cube designer, I would encourage you to try and play more cards rather than less if you're on the fence about, like, putting a card in your deck versus not. I know we all like to try and spike the draft and do the best we can, but if you're, like, kind of on the fence, play a card maybe you haven't played before, or wouldn't normally main deck or whatever, just to try and get some experience with it, because it's so hard to know what works aside from what actually gets played. And I've had the experience of putting either individual cards or whole archetypes into my cube that people just completely ignore and never draft. And it's like, okay, well, I'm glad you all agreed this is bad, but none of us have ever played with it, so it's hard for us to actually make that evaluation when we're just kind of leaning on our expectations and our bias to, like, inform that decision instead of actual playtesting experience.
No one else has ever put Puppet Conjurer. Oh, wait, no, that's not true. I have won and lost a Puppet Conjurer. Never mind, ignore me, card's great.
You've lost a Puppet Conjurer.
I've lost a Puppet Conjurer.
I mean, Puppet Conjurer is a great little case study. I know this is a card that you really like for a variety of reasons, but one of them is that it's like a bridge. It's like a staple card between a lot of different archetypes you want to support in your cube, but it's a card that people, don't really know much about. Like, not many people are familiar with Puppet Conjurer, and once you read it, it kind of feels a little underwhelming, and so it's especially weird to see it in, like, on a black card. Like, it's a weird effect for a black card to have, and so it's a perfect example of a card that could be, an all-star. It could be great in your cube, but people are just going to take shock over it because they know what shock does and they don't know what Puppet Conjurer does.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, and that also goes hand in hand with what we were talking about last week about sort of, like, adding complexity. especially complexity that isn't adding something like unique to the game. So I specifically avoided a lot of the double face lands because they are just like not a clean read, and they don't do anything that's that mechanically different from a fetch land, really, if you're just playing with basics. And we sort of talked about how, like, well, it's not actually going to confuse most people. Like, every once in a while, there'd be a player that is new enough that has never seen this double face card. So, like, why do we even really consider that an issue? Well, like, all of that complexity really, really does add up, because every player is going to look at a cube, especially like this lower powered cube with a lot of cards they haven't seen before, and they're going to overlook things. So
Right.
all of that really, really does take a toll, even if it's just a little bit at a time.
So, I mean, I guess at the end of the day, I don't have a great answer for what to do when people are ignoring something in your cube. I think trying to draft it yourself is a great strategy. Ultimately, I think something is really great if you can find it. Like, finding playtesters that are invested in your cube in a deeper way, I think is valuable. People that will kind of put on a little bit of the designer hat with you and say, you know what, I'm going to, I saw a couple cards that maybe indicate this deck is open. Even if I'm skeptical about it, I'm going to try drafting it to see what happens, right? Which a lot of players are not going to be willing to do. Some players are just not willing to draft suboptimally or do something they wouldn't otherwise do for the sort of experiment version of it. But if you can get players that will, I think that's a great virtue to you. And then playing your cube as much as you possibly can, which is hard, especially hard now, Anthony, during COVID. But more opportunities to actually get reps in and actually play these decks, I think, is the best thing for them. And if you can demonstrate yourself a couple times the deck works, maybe you can convert some people into to actually drafting it. But it's hard. I mean, I feel this way still about black aggro. We've talked about it on the show before. I want it to work because I don't support Reanimator in my cube. I don't support Storm, so there's not a lot for black to do besides remove stuff and remove stuff. So I want there to be this sort of proactive, aggressive strategy in black to sort of round out that color's identity in my cube. But people don't like to draft it. And it does well sometimes. I notoriously go 1-2 with it pretty often when I draft it. But, it's not a bad deck, I don't think. It can work sometimes. And people don't give it a shot. And with Zendikar Rising, that deck is going to get, like, probably 6 or 7 really good new cards, and it's not going to change people's perceptions of that deck, right? Like, people know my cube, they've played my cube before. Even if the black section gets 7 new cards, which is like 20% new cards or 15% new cards or whatever for that entire section, it's not going to change their perceptions. They're still not going to draft that deck, I don't think.
I don't know. I mean, the Skyclave Demon might just be splashy enough to get people excited about it.
Oh, that one's not going in. That one's not good enough.
Yeah, fair enough. So the other thing that I think really helps surprisingly much is, like, when you're adding cards that you think are, less known, people might overlook them. Just think about who are they for. This always really helps me where I'm putting it. Like, I know in a very literal, concrete way the sort of tendencies of the specific players in my play group, but I could easily sort of abstract that to more general, like, psychographics if we wanted to get real nerdy about it.
Yeah, for example, Andy tends to draft, like, really cool, really powerful decks that are really sexy, and other people do other stuff, but that's what Andy does.
Well, sure. Andy drafts hyper-consistent 2-1 decks, whereas Daniel drafts all gold cards and old legends. Jay just drafts whatever is the best. These are just examples. But knowing when I put Noy and Dar in my cube, like, well, most people aren't going to like this and might overlook it, but I know there is, 1 in 10 players. This really is going to strike something, resonate with them. It's going to strike some part of their interest in Magic. And that just means it's, like, delightful when you see people actually do take those cards that are not played as often. But if you put a card in and you can't actually explain, like, not just what deck does it fit in, but what player is that going to appeal to, there might be an issue.
I guess I should say, like, I'm mostly interested in this topic as a means of taking this feedback to help better balance a cube, on the assumption that your cube design goals, listener, are to some degree to have players competing on an equal playing field. And obviously, I think that's different levels of importance to different kinds of cube designers. Some people, their cube is just a museum of historically relevant cards in Magic, and they don't really care if it's balanced or not. They just want, people to play these cool cards that they really like and get a chance to, play those out. In which case, you might not care about this at all, and you may be entirely focused on this kind of psychographic. I want to make sure there's something for everybody in my environment. I actually, personally, I don't really think in those terms. I feel like I don't have to put stuff there for quote-unquote Timmys and Tammys or Johnnies and Jennies or whatever. I feel like if I build an environment, those people will find the sort of thing that caters to them regardless of what the environment looks like. Like, it's hard for me to imagine putting our friend Daniel in front of a cube and having Daniel not find something to bring him joy to do in that cube no matter what kind of cards are included.
We'll find a way to draft Night Tribal no matter what.
Right, right. That's you're referencing a time where Daniel was playing my cube and excitedly told me he drafted a Night Tribal deck, which is not a deck I support at all, or it didn't in my cube. At the end of the draft, he was like, "I drafted this sick Night Tribal deck." He ended up going 2-1 that draft, and it was just because he kept strip mine locking people. What he meant by Night Tribal is I'm going to use Knight of the Reliquary to go get strip mine, and also there's a History of Benalia in my deck. That's my Night Tribal deck. His view on the game is so completely different from mine that I don't have to like. I first of all, I couldn't sit at a table and be like, what are the cards Daniel's going to like? Because he's so far away from my sort of set of values. But also, I don't need to, right? I put a cube together and Daniel will find something to do in it. Similarly, people that want to, spike it will try to find the best strategy, no matter, what that strategy is. So I actually really don't think in those terms. I spend most of my energy thinking about if people draft this deck, this color combination, are they going to be severely disadvantaged against other decks in the field? Because I feel like if you get that balance right, then the rest will just happen naturally, is kind of my perspective on that.
I mean, you say that, but you're also talking about the issue that, like, you think the mono-black aggressive deck is balanced and present, but people just don't want to play it.
Well, but I say don't want to. I think they think it's bad. I think there are players whose things they like to do in Magic would align very well with this deck that are playing the cube. I think they look at these cards and think, this card is bad, why would I play it?
What's the difference between thinking it's bad and not wanting to play it? Those seem like they overlap a lot.
Well, some players, I don't think they decide if they want to play a card based on how good it is. They decide on if they want to play a card based on if it will be fun to cast, or if they can create a cool story, or, I mean, we keep referencing Daniel here. We love you, Daniel, if you're listening. I don't think Daniel sits down and looks at a pack most of the time and says, like, which of these picks is going to maximize my win percentage, which is a very specific angle on the game. I think the spikier players that are playing my cube look at a pack and don't think the black aggro cards are going to maximize the win percentage because it hasn't been proven to them. And so they're just like, well, that's a risk. Instead, I'll play red aggro, white aggro, because I know those things to be more successful in this environment, at least.
No, that makes sense. You might end up just having to cut red aggro entirely. That's the only answer.
Yeah, you had a bad experience with red aggro on the rotisserie draft. That's a good segue, Anthony. So the next question I have, which is something that comes up a lot, is how you process feedback from players that a card is too powerful. A card is not powerful enough. A whole deck is too powerful. A whole deck is not powerful enough. When someone has experience playing a cube and they feel like this experience has taught them that this thing is too good or not good enough, and they give you that feedback, which you will get if you've ever designed a cube, people will tell you this. How do you process that feedback, Anthony? Let's start with you.
I mean, the answer is really simple. You just have to take it as graciously as you can and just consider it a single data point, because players don't have a perfect picture on the entire context. I struggle with it a little bit because the feedback I mostly get is on the negative side. This card is too bad. I think
that's most people. I think people that win the draft, unless they basically felt guilty for subjecting their opponents to being crushed, they are probably not going to report, my deck is too good. They're going to report you, yeah, it was hard, I barely got there, I scraped by, but my skill and wit allowed me to win with this deck. But people that lose are going to blame the cards, they're going to blame the deck, they're going to blame the environment rather than themselves.
Maybe we were trying to figure out what causes power creep in cube. Maybe that's really the biggest underlying force.
I think that's a big part of it, honestly, is that I think just humans are naturally not willing to admit that their wins just came from my cards were better and I didn't make any skillful decisions. And people that lose, are very quick to say, like, well, I had no options. I couldn't do anything. I was hopeless.
Definitely.
So you said take it graciously and then treat it as one data point. I'll add that we both work in website design and development. That's what we do for a living. And so we have a lot of clients. We have this sort of, a client-vendor relationship where we're providing services for somebody and they're our client and we're trying to make them happy. And we always have to get feedback from our clients, right, about a thing that's implemented, about a design, about a website or whatever. And getting the right kind of feedback is challenging in that context. What I always ask people to do as much as possible is describe the problem they have instead of just describing a solution they imagine for that problem. Because this happens, in any kind of like feedback in that relationship we talked about. This happens in Cube, I think, too, where people will jump from, I had this problem in the draft or in my games, and instead of saying, hey, Cube Designer, here's what I ran up against, here's this problem I had, they will jump to, this card has to be cut. Or they will jump to, the red aggro deck is too good because they had too many burn spells and I couldn't land any of my creatures or whatever. And so I think anytime I get that kind of feedback, I will always, again, I try and take it graciously, like you said. I think it's important to, as a cube designer, expect this kind of feedback, and it's hard not to take it personally when you've spent a lot of time working on an environment and somebody plays it once and then says, like, you screwed it all up, this is all wrong and too powerful. But take it graciously, and then also, as much as possible, try and ask them what has led them to that conclusion, because what you really care about is not the conclusion this person has made from their experience. You want to understand their experience. If you could clone yourself 7 times and sit down at the draft table and draft and play games against yourself, one version of you is going to go 0-3, and one version of you is going to go 3-0, and you're going to have this whole wide range of experience. We can't do that, obviously. So a big part of how I look at playtesting is like, I wish I could be in everyone's shoes, and when I'm talking to them, I'm trying to ask them questions to get in their shoes and figure out what the problem was. You oftentimes learn a lot by asking those kinds of questions to get to the underlying problem of like why you think this deck is too good. And then you arrive at what you alluded to earlier, Anthony, which is like these cohesive and thorough explanations for why something is good or bad. If you just say aggro is too good or white is bad or whatever, that's not very illuminating. But if you say like, oh, all of the non-aggressive decks don't have access to board wipes. And so any of the proactive decks that put a bunch of threats into play don't have to worry about losing out on a lot of card advantage later on because there's no opportunity for those other decks to wipe the board. So the sort of explanation of this environment is that, playing as fast and proactive as possible is highly advantaged because there's no board wipes or things like that going on. Or you can say, in this environment, the gold cards are so much better than the sort of monocolored cards, and the fixing is so prevalent that you actually should just be taking all the fixing and all the gold cards and play 5-color good stuff. And you can come up with explanations that do a much better job explaining something than, again, that result. We don't care about the result. I don't care that the result is that you think we should cut the Gitrog monster. I care about the experience you had that led you to that conclusion, and then the discourse we can have about that to maybe come to an explanatory answer about what's going on in this environment.
Right. So somebody comes to you and they say, well, this card was bad. You need to put in the better version. And what you need to break it back to is like, well, why was that card non-functional? Like, why was it stranded in your hand? Is it not that card needs to change, but also is it that there are like other effects in the environment where like maybe just card advantage is too potent so that a burn spell just doesn't work, or maybe just it doesn't align with the threats and you actually want to cut down some of the creatures so they actually align better with the removal, rather than just saying like this one card that a player felt didn't suit their needs is the problem and that's the fix.
And I think players' feedback will often be distilled to that level because it's so specific. They're like, this card didn't do what I wanted. This card is bad.
Right.
But the truth is, and this is also demonstrated in Jet's article I linked in the show notes, that a card's performance is really just directly connected to its deck's performance. Individual cards are almost impossible to like measure their different impacts on a sort of environment. And the example he gives is that he actually collects really detailed data for all of his draft and has done so for years with his cube. He can rank cards by their win percentage. And, Jackal has one of the highest win percentages in the entire cube, including better than many other much better red 1-drops. Like Jackal has a higher win percentage than Goblin Guide, than Monastery Swiftspear. And you could say, maybe we're all wrong, and Goblin Guide and Monastery Swiftspear are worse than Jackal, or you could say that turns out the red aggro deck is very, very good, and so if you have Jackal in your red aggro deck, that means you're doing a good job, whereas maybe these other cards that are appealing, maybe the Monastery Swiftspear gets snapped up by some blue-red tempo deck that isn't as linear and efficient and doesn't have as good of a win record. So really, like, the deck is the thing that matters, but people's feedback will oftentimes come in the sort of most detailed version, which is like individual cards, but that's not the most useful for you as a cube designer.
Well, I mean, it's maybe not the most useful form, but it is the data that you get. Like, that's how people are going to respond.
It's all you have, pretty much.
It's the starting point, and it is still valuable to pay attention to it.
The other thing I will say, which I think is worth mentioning, is that I kind of alluded to earlier, like the good players will often just win, and maybe less experienced players will not do as well. I think it's an important thing to remember. And, it's a careful topic because you don't want to be telling your friend, like, sorry, I'm ignoring your feedback because I know you're a bad drafter, or, vice versa. Sorry, I'm ignoring your feedback because I know you're a really good drafter. But people will oftentimes point to LSV's great performance in the MTGO Vintage Cube. And the reality is that LSV is among the, maybe top 5 most skilled, experienced Magic players that are living right now, that are playing on MTGO. So, like, the absolute upper crust of the skill level on that platform, such that you could give LSV a deck that was probably much worse than many other decks, and he would still, by virtue of his much more skilled and experienced play, be able to be successful with it, which actually kind of renders a lot of LSV's, like, what you would learn about how to draft Vintage Cube from LSV not as relevant, because you're not going to play as tight as he does, and so there's going to be a much higher threshold on your deck being good than there is for him when he's playing, and vice versa, obviously. Like, if you are an inexperienced player or inexperienced playing a particular archetype, or, like me, I have played very little combo in my entire life because I don't really play constructed, and I've never had a cube really that supported combo. I'm not a good combo player. So if I draft a combo deck, it's going to look at the combo deck as probably worse than it actually is. And so that's just important for you to be aware of, I think, and it just, I think, reemphasizes the point that, all data is anecdotal, and, it's all just one data point in sort of an ocean. And I actually think where you have to be most concerned about it is if you do have a more skilled person in your play group. Like, we've talked about our friend Jay before. Jay's just a much more practiced Magic player than we are. He's been grinding for a long time. He's much more diligent about practice. And, it makes better in-play decisions than most of us do in our play group. And I think it's most tempting to want to follow Jay's advice when Jay says a card is good or bad, or, something is powerful or not powerful. But actually, Jay might be one of the worst people in terms of giving you feedback on the cube, because everything Jay does seems to work, so he must be right. And, that is not challenged quite as much as somebody who is maybe more in the middle tier of that skill level.
Yeah, I think the other thing that's adjacent to that is that, for me personally, and obviously, like, everybody should be aware of, like, who they are designing the cube for, and, like, who are the people in your playgroup, what do they enjoy. But for me personally, it is definitely a goal that I don't want it to be my cube to be only fun for the most experienced players. I want it to be something that is approachable to even people that are, maybe just, like, competent at a standard draft format. I would love for this to be a kind of cube that they could approach and have a good time with.
Yeah, and all of this goes for, like, you can ask them about power level. You ask them about just fun, too. Who had fun, who didn't have fun, and why? And, like, that's not a thing that maybe you're... Yeah. You should, I think, ultimately be trying to balance for fun. It's more subjective than who won or lost, right? Like, some things people will enjoy, some things always won't enjoy, and so you can't say, like, this is an inherently unfun or fun strategy. But, yeah, I think it's important to ask your players all these questions. All right, can we summarize the stuff we've been through so far? Just because I want to make sure that we're, like... I want this to be useful for people. I want to try and help people, Anthony. That's my overall goal. We talked about what to do with actual, results. This deck 3-0, this deck 0-3, how do you kind of treat that when you're thinking about your cube design? And I think our sort of outcome from that was... trust the experience, not the results, and, try and get at the underlying reasons why things ended up that way, rather than just saying this data matters. And honestly, I pretty much completely ignore actual results most of the time, unless there's a really, really blatant pattern that is making itself known.
Yeah, the results are definitely useful data, but they are less important than I think the qualitative experience because of how limited that data is.
And then when you get feedback from somebody that something is too good or too bad, similar to the results, I think it's important to ask questions to understand what the sort of problem or exact gameplay scenarios that player ran up against that caused them to come to the conclusion that thing is too good or too bad, and really unpack that. Because, again, we want to try and get to the underlying experience of our players rather than trusting their sort of synthesis of that into the sort of digestible sound bites of this card's too good, it has to go, or this card is trash, or this card is unplayable. That's not useful for us. What's useful is, why do you think that card is unplayable? And if you haven't played it, why haven't you played it? The question of putting things in your cube that people just don't play, that's one of the hardest ones for me. I think trying as much as possible to find players that are interested in your cube. I'd say curious about your cube. They want to play it because they want to understand it and explore it as much as you do. And, not just, to win or whatever, just to play Magic. And maybe one of the ways to do that is just to make it clear that you're looking for feedback and you want advice for what to add and what to cut. I try as much as possible to, like, give people credit. Like, if I add a card because someone mentioned it and it does well, I'll be like, thanks to so-and-so for pointing that card out or whatever. I just think it helps make people feel a little more invested and feel less like they're just drafting any old draft and more like they're participating in the sort of development of an actual limited environment. One thing we didn't touch on, which I think is important, is I think it's really important to try to articulate your goals to anybody that is invested enough that they've gotten to the point of, like, giving you specific feedback, like cut this card, add this card. Because your goals are unique to your own environment. And if you haven't articulated them, it's very hard for people to actually give you feedback that aligns with those goals, right? They will just give you feedback as a player. And feedback as a player is much different from what you're trying to encourage, right? Like, their feedback might be about, I just want to win more, so we should do less at this thing. And what you're actually trying to accomplish is making that thing viable. And so instead of cutting that thing away so it's all the winningest strategies, you actually want to, like, nerf that winning strategy so that thing that you are interested in can shine.
Yeah, and part of that is both, like, what are the goals that you have? And again, like we said, who is your actual audience for it? Because that has a huge impact on what's appropriate.
The other thing I want to mention which I'm curious now what you think about this, Anthony. I've noticed that people, and this may be biased because you and I are pretty invested in the cube community on account of doing podcasts and being involved in all these communities, but I think a lot of people that own cubes spend a lot more time thinking about their cube and like quote unquote theory crafting it than they do actually playing it, which is just, a practical concern, right? Like it's hard to get a bunch of people together to draft your cube. It takes a long period of time, so you have to like block some time off. Whereas, in between, on your lunch break or whatever, or, in 30 minutes before you go to bed, you can sit down and, think about your cube, move some cards around, try and like fiddle with some stuff and figure things out. I think it's important to have that time, that like theory crafting time, but I think it's very easy to get lost in that kind of world and kind of like build up layers of assumptions about something based on these stories you're telling yourself that may not be borne out in actual playtesting.
Right. I mean, you can get extremely, extremely precious about it. And that's one of the great things about designing a cube is it's like building 3 or 4 commander decks all at once. You get to dig through all of the history of Magic and find all the things that really resonate with you most and you think are interesting to put together. But if you get too precious about it, then it can be an unpleasant experience when you first test it, which is why my recommendation to people is always like, get something together as quickly as possible, or as quickly as you think is like valuable and interesting to you and you're getting value out of it. But not so much that you're being so precious about it that you're committed to things, because things will not play the way you expect.
Yeah, and with this new cube project I've been working on, I'm very, very lucky to have a group of people on the Discord that are very invested in this project with me, that are willing to talk about it all the time and like, talk through things and try and figure out how it ticks. But I think one side effect of that, if you are in that position or you do have, even one other friend of yours that's really involved with your cube and you kind of like work on it together or whatever, is that if you spend a lot of time theory crafting and talking through your environment in the abstract, I think what can happen is that the few moments that are punctuated by actual playtest experience can oftentimes seem to carry more weight because, let's say you play your cube once a week. I mean, even that I think is a lot for most cube designers. I think on average, probably most cube designers play once a month, maybe even less. If you play once a week and then you spend the whole week with your play group talking about that play experience, I think oftentimes the results we were talking about, not the sort of underlying reasons, but just the results can take on like a bigger presence than they actually hold, where it seems like, oh, well, is 2 weeks in a row, this deck's done really well. And so that feels like it's been an eternity. We've been talking about this cube forever, and it's always just, we keep coming back to this deck is always the problem deck. And I think it's important to kind of keep perspective if you are going to spend a lot of time theory crafting, because you can oftentimes get in a situation where you're like, well, this seemed too good, what if we cut that? And then you kind of like stack up all these layers of like domino effect changes on a cube, because everything is all connected. So if you make an assumption about something being too good or not good enough or needing to come out because it doesn't align with your goals, and then that sort of domino effect can like knock over a bunch of other tiles and it leads to a bunch of other changes, you can very easily get yourself into a position where like you've made a sweeping change to your cube off of what is actually coming back to that like anecdotal data, because you've been too deep in the hole of being precious about like making changes based on what you're sort of reckoning about the environment is. I do think, for what it's worth though, that theory crafting time is very valuable. I think that, we just talked about all the reasons why the actual results are not what's important, and it's the experience is what's important. You can make a strong, explanatory case for why a deck is good or bad without even playing it oftentimes, right? There are archetypes I have slotted into this cube and then been like, you know what? Based on the sort of, I can play out in my head how this would play out against the sort of decks I know work in this format, and for that reason, this deck won't work for these reasons. And you can actually get to a place where, with a lot of certainty, you can say, this really doesn't actually work. And that is valuable time to spend. It's just you have to be careful to do that in measure with actual playtesting experience, I think.
Sure. I mean, we can't take this to the extreme and say, like, there's no design time. Like, you have to spend time doing the work. And we're also, like, even though we like to think about how cards are extremely recontextualized when you put them into a new cube, we do still have a lot of like information from other Magic experiences we can borrow from, and if we have some expectation for how certain decks will play out, we can imagine those matchups that you're describing.
Yeah. So I think at time is valuable. It just is something you have to keep in balance with your actual playtesting time and try and keep these scales balanced. And I'll say too, one thing I've run up against is that a lot of times people that are working with you will have very different natural values when it comes to these different scales. Like some people might really value that playtesting and feel like, I won with this deck, it means it's really good. And some people might completely disregard it and say that's completely irrelevant. And, I think my deck is good, even though I've been playing it for 5 weeks in this cube and never done better than 1-2. But I still think this is the best deck in the entire environment because I've convinced myself based on some story in my head. And so there are extremes of this. And I think you as a cube designer should try to strive to find that balance that's right for you and your environment. And it can be hard oftentimes to take the feedback of people that are on the extremes. And I can say I have people on both extremes that are helping me with this cube where it's like one person thinks this deck is just the best deck by a wide margin, and no one has ever done better than 1-2 with it. And it's like, you could be right, but we have all these explanations for why it's not the case, and also it has not been disproven in our sort of playtesting, and so it's hard to make those, it's hard to have those conversations with people when your values are off, and it makes for, I think, interesting friction that can lead to good improvements for an environment.
But even if a deck isn't good, if people enjoy drafting it, maybe it's just fine.
Yeah, could be true. If everyone's favorite deck to 1-2 with.
Honestly, that's the best. It's really easy to make allow people to have a good time drafting the 3-0 deck. It's very hard to make the 1-2 deck that people still have a good time with.
I totally agree. If you can make an environment where people are happy to lose, I think you've done something pretty impressive.
I just want to play Magic so bad now. We got to do some kind of team draft or two-headed giant somehow.
I'll play Magic with you whenever you want. You got to get on more of these drafts on the
All
Discord. Right. And also, I'm just around. Let's play Magic, man.
Magic scheduled. I want to cast Gonti, Lord of Luxury.
Such a luxurious man.
He's so luxurious.
This has been Lucky Paper Radio. Thank you for tuning in and talking about Magic with us. I hope we got to help some people this week. That's the whole goal of the podcast, is maybe to change the way you think about your cube and make your cube design a little more better for you and your play group. That was not articulate or well worded, but you know what? We're not going to take it again. All of our music is produced by DJ James Nasty, so check him out online to get some cool beats to shake your butt to. And what other credits do we have? You can find us online at luckypaper.co. We put out our Zendikar Rising perspective this past week, so if you want to check out how the survey we've been bugging you to fill out results came in, you can go see that on our website, luckypaper.co. It's lots of cool things to learn there. And I don't know. Maybe see you in the Discord. You can talk about this weird cube I've been working on with me. Thank you, Anthony, for talking about Magic with me.
Hey, thanks for talking about Magic with me.